Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the Designing and Retool workshop. This meetup is the second installment of our monthly community Retool community meetup, which is open to anyone interested in learning more about how to use Retool. My name is Alina. I am a community manager here at Retool, and I'm based in the Bay Area. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my brilliant colleagues, John Walls, a sales engineer based out of London, and Julie Chen, a deployed engineer based out of New York. Today, we're going to talk about designing intuitive apps in Retool. John and Julie will spend some time going over best practices on how to design Retool apps that are visually appealing and fitting to your business needs. We'll go over why you should care about design in your internal tools, goals to keep in mind during your build, and styling and Retool hacks. Afterwards, we're going to dive into answering your questions. Please use the question icon at the bottom right part of your screen to ask questions and upvote existing ones. I'll now hand the mic off to John, who will talk about why design is important.
Sure, thanks, Alina. Before we get into the design piece of it, we thought just a couple of minutes talking about why design is important and what's important about it. And on the why side, it can make a huge difference to the speed at which your application rolls out in terms of user adoption. Can make it much easier just to get the training done if you're introducing a new application, and get you less requests for changes and things like that. Genuinely make your life easier in the long run. And just as builders and developers ourselves, design is a skill. It's really something that's worthwhile learning for application development or interaction design, skills like those. So very much worthwhile. The way I put it is, if you're spending a day in an app, spend an hour just on the design. If you're taking a week to build something, take half a day. Put some time towards it. It really does pay off. And in terms of what you're trying to achieve with that time, I'll pass over to Julie.
Yeah, hopefully we can all agree that design is important. The big question is, how do we actually design in Retool? So we have three priorities internally at Retool when we're designing Retool apps. The first priority and the first goal of designing anything, and as John said, it's important to set aside designated time for design. And the first priority is usability. So your app should be intuitive to use. They should be usable. Your users should need limited training or guidance to actually use these apps. And some questions that John and I often ask to test usability of an app are, what is the main goal of this app? And is that clear on the first time a user lands on the app? Can a user easily get their tasks done? Will users need assistance using this app? You will know if an app is usable or not when you're getting few complaints, your app is hitting metrics like saving time, reducing errors, and new users immediately know how to engage with the app, and that can quickly be sought out through user testing. So that was the first priority, which is usability. The second priority is credibility. So your apps should make a good first impression. They should gain people's trust as soon as they're logging on. There should be identifiable branding and coloring that matches the theme of your company. The app should look complete. It should be organized. It should be thoughtful. Questions that John and I asked to check credibility are, does this app fit in with all of our other apps? Is it beautiful and really pleasing to the eye? Do users have a good first impression of this app? You know your app is credible when your intended users are using the app instead of alternatives, and new users are excited by the app. You hear a lot of wows, you hear a lot of impressed noises and smiles. That's how you can tell if an app is credible. So that was usability, credibility. The third one is maintainability, the often forgotten about but very equally important goal of design. So your app should be maintainable for future builders to make changes, to debug. For example, you should reuse components when possible and keep naming conventions, have a global theme to make coloring easy. Questions that John and I ask to check maintainability are, is the code consistent and easy to read? Are components and queries organized? Is it easy to follow the workflow within the app? So those are the three priorities that we keep in mind when designing apps: usability, maintainability, and credibility. Back over to John, who will actually start showing you an example app with these three priorities in mind.
Yeah, so let's bring up the application we're going to use for this session. There you go. That looks like it should be showing to you. And hopefully, well, maybe not to blow our own trumpet, but hopefully you immediately get some of that feeling that what we're talking about when you see this app for the first time. There are, and we'll get into the details of this, but there are certain conventions to it that people will naturally recognize from other websites or applications they've used. This is a fictitious example, but we would probably recognize the color scheme and the branding. And there's some details to basically how it's done, how it's laid out, that give you this first impression, this credibility that can make all the difference in terms of having people, use the thing that you've built. So let's go into the edit mode and talk through the individual things that we've been doing here to hopefully have that impact. And I'll go through theme and color. I'll go through navigation. I'll make some layout points. So the overall structure and first impression you're getting from the app. So let's talk about the theme. So if we look at a button, I have a primary button here on the top right-hand side. And if I was to scroll down and look at the style section on that, it's defaulting to the primary color that's part of this theme. And having that in place and reusing that color and things like the navigation bar and so on, just adds to the overall consistency of the app. Now you get to your app settings or the theme through the app settings, and we have a variety picked out. If I were to switch to a different theme, you can just see that the button's turning green there. So these things will make instance-wide changes to any application that is using a particular theme. So very worthwhile setting up a default. And the kind of things you can do inside that theme, which is available from the settings page, is probably the main one is the primary color. Quite often the brand color, if your brand suits that for the button. I'm personally very fond of using a kind of medium or light gray as an additional color, because I like using that in a lot of text and kind of light text, and maybe a color that contrasts with the primary color, really useful for nav bars and things like that. And you can also do things like change the warning colors, the success, error messages, and so on. So really worthwhile going through this page and picking out a set of colors for fonts, for the canvas serves, and so on, to give you this overall look and feel on the app. And then that's all available to you as a developer. So the button will default to the primary color. I've got some headings here in text, and you can see down in the bottom right-hand side, these are set to the secondary color. So getting that light gray text is really easy and consistent when you've got the color set up. And additionally, if you've got anywhere that you might want to refer to color in your JavaScript, such as I have an option here where I want a little green light, I want the standard green, if you like. And inside the setting for that, I can refer to the theme.success inside of the JavaScript. And I've got access to all of the colors that are set up in the palette in my code as well, if I want to do any dynamic color setting or anything like that. So that's theme and color. Let's talk about navigation a bit. So we have the most common option is the navigation bar. We have the horizontal one at the top. We now have, or it's actually in the process of shipping, but if you don't have it today, you will have it fairly soon, the vertical navigation option that we can fit into the new sidebar. And you don't necessarily need one of these, and you certainly don't necessarily need two, but just to give you a little hint as to why you might use two and how you would split them up. If you are going down this route of having top and left side navigation bars, the top would normally be kind of department level, very high level things. Think of a shop that sells both furnishing and clothing. Those would be top level things, while down the left-hand side would be more things like what type of furnishing. Is it for the living room or is it for the kitchen? And there's probably a similar kind of model you might use for your own navigation. It's also important to consider navigation within the page. So we have a tabbed container. We've got 3 different headings to it. Just by glancing at the page and the headings gives the user some feel for how to move around the page. And they're particularly useful, the containers, for focusing the user's attention on the form they need to complete or the information they need to look at, rather than having people having to navigate through the entire application to find, for instance, the customer profile that has their historical data. So navigation, not necessarily just about between apps, but also within the app on the page. Try to break things up so that people can see signposts for where they could be working, and so that they can focus on the task at hand. All of that is going to really add to the usability of the application. And then finally, for my piece, let's talk about layout a little bit. Now, layout is interesting in that there is no, hopefully, obviously, there's no one layout that you can just use for your applications. This is, we think of it as a customer success dashboard, where there's, there's a table on the left and a kind of action panel, if you like, on the right-hand side. You might have more of an analytical dashboard that would be full of charts, more visual from that point of view. You might have a workflow that goes through steps. So do follow up with the examples we're going to share after this webinar on different kinds of layout. But we can give you a few tips. So be consistent with the boundaries. So typically the navigation bars will be to the top and to the left. The logo, which is quite often a home button, would be top left. And top right is popular for things like search bars, for account settings buttons, for alerts badges, that kind of thing. So that's a fairly consistent kind of layout that people will see elsewhere. Within your application, the big tip is to think in terms of maybe a visual hierarchy. So it's quite a big concept in its own right, interesting to look up. But essentially think many an app has a big bit, a medium bit, and a small bit, or a more important and a less important. And you can kind of go left to right, top to bottom, big to small, and bold font to light font. So for instance, we've got the customer table here is the most important part of this app. We have the customer title at the top. We're using Markdown, and we can change the number of the level of the heading. So I could shrink down the customer's piece, but because it's the most important part of the app, I want to keep it nice and large. The medium panel here on the billing and security, we've got a level 5 header now for the text, so it's a bit smaller, and the account actions, like we touched on, is in the light gray. So there's a clear hierarchy to the page, and that gives a certain flow to things as well that can be really useful to the user. And then the final thing that can make possibly the biggest first impression, or at least with a lot of apps I see when we're at proof of concept stage, is getting alignment right on your page. So if you look at the security, billing, and account here, they're all in a nice column. The headings are all in the same place. The labels are all lined up. There's a nice clear gap that goes down the middle. We'll often see like buttons or tables in quite different places on a first version. It's really good just to get things aligned, makes things a whole lot different to the user, a whole lot better. And one particular tip, and it's a little thing that's kind of new for people who have been using Retool for a while, is to get these things lined up. Do take a look at the alignment and width buttons that are in the style panel. So previously, or going back a few versions, you could only set the percentage. So you'd say, let's say 33% width on a widget. But now we can set that to columns. So here what we've done is everything's been aligned to the right for the labels, so they're all lined up. And in the same way that we have a 4-unit text box there, we've got a 4-unit label in the widget above, and it's keeping it all nicely aligned. It's a detail point, but one I highly recommend you spend a bit of time on. So hopefully there, from color, navigation, layout, you've got a good foundation, if you like, for building out the real interactivity and functionality of the app. And for that, I will pass you over to Julie.
Thanks, John. I'm now sharing my screen. It's the same app that John's seeing. I know we were seeing some issues with blurriness, so I'll try to zoom in and increase my font size when possible, but keep me posted if you aren't able to see anything. So thanks, John, for covering the high-level theme and layout of this app. I want to dive a little bit deeper and give tips on 3 specific commonly used components in our Retool apps: the table component, the icon component, and the button and link components. If you're not familiar, Retool has over 100 pre-built components. You can see all of these in our right panel here. And you can drag and drop these components onto the main Retool canvas for quick and beautiful UIs. Each of our components has native color pickers and properties to customize the look and feel of the component. So I wanted to dive deeper into 3 specific ones to show you how we like to make them the most beautiful possible. So the first one I want to start with is the table component. So right here in this app, we have a table component that has all of our customer data on it. Table component is our most used component, given it's a very straightforward way to represent data, and there are loads of data and design enhancements you can make to the table. The main design focus for tables is your table columns. As you can see here, we have a bunch of different columns with different styling and design. You can customize your columns in the Inspect tab of the right panel. And there are many features in Retool that allow you to make your custom tables more usable and intuitive, going back to our 3 goals of building beautiful apps. First thing is you can change the order or title of columns. Here we prefer the company name to be first, but you could also drag it to be third in order. You might also want some columns to be editable by users. In that case, you can check off that the column's editable here. For example, the company name and the date are editable, so I can click into that column and edit the column. You might also want to hide some of your columns from your end users. So our last updated column is hidden here by toggling on this eye icon. So those are kind of quick wins that you can do to just clean up the data within a table. But there are also many features in Retool that allow you to make your tables more credible and aesthetic. For example, our admin column here is of type user email, which will read in a user's email and display their full name, their Retool profile photo, and their email. Another example of a well-designed column is our plan column. Many of our customers are on different plans. You might be on our Pro plan, Plus plan, Trial plan, and we use tags here to categorize these rows. We use very light, semi-transparent background colors that fit in with our themes, and visually this is a great way to categorize these customers quickly. The last column that we have here with some custom visualization that I actually want to show some of the tag JavaScript that we've written is our % month-over-month change column. So tags are not only a great way to categorize, but they're a great way to visually represent data trends. So for example, if you want to use color to identify trends with month-over-month growth, if it's green, you want it to be, or if it's positive, you want it to be green with an up arrow, and if it's negative, you want it to be red with a down arrow. You can customize all of this tag coloring and labels using some custom JavaScript in your column settings. Those are some ways to enhance the column-specific design, but the table component overall also has various style options. So if you scroll all the way to the bottom in your Inspect tab again, you can see the very comprehensive styles that we have per our table component. Some things that I like to do for a cleaner table is I remove the outside border, I remove the inside vertical borders here, so I don't show any of these borders, and I remove the box shadow. So if I click out of this table, it looks perfectly embedded into our main app, and it's quite a clean and aesthetic look. So instantly, with a few changes to columns and table styles, our table already looks so much better. So that is the table component, most used component, but there's also 2 other components that deserve a lot of love and help with the design. The second component is our icon component. Icons really elevate the look and feel of an app and intuitively guide users through their workflows within your app. We recommend sticking to one style of icons for the entire app. So some icons have a lot of details, others look very minimalistic, some have outlines, some are filled. Ours here are filled and pretty minimal. So we would curate a consistent icon set across all of your apps and then use them all over parts of navigation and buttons to emphasize the actions taken by users. So this app, we use icons everywhere. On the sidebar that John was talking about, we use icons to differentiate the different options in navigation. You can click on one of the navigation settings and see that for our customers tab, we have a icon that's to users that tells users exactly what they're clicking on. We also use icons in our account actions list right here. So this is a link list, a list of 4 links that a user could press. And for the downgrade account, we have a download icon. You can also use icons in specific text components. So for the editable text date that we have here, we have a date component. Again, the quicker and the more intuitive an app is with icons, the faster they go through their workflows, the easier it is to onboard a user. So icons are great ways to guide user actions for better usability. That leads to better performance, efficiency. The faster a user can go through your app, the more efficient your business is. So that was the second component, icons. The third suite of components are buttons and links. Those are two most interactive components when you want users to actually take an action with your app. So these action buttons are extremely important to be usable, credible, beautiful. Obviously, these are what end users are going to be interacting with the most in your app. So we have various buttons in this app. On first look, you can see that we've reserved the solid button color for one very important action, which is adding a new customer. We try not to have more than one button with a solid background. That can detract users. It can be a little bit messy and distracting. But we have other tricks for secondary actions. So some examples of secondary actions are these links that we have here that look like text, but are in fact links. You can also have, for example, in our product feedback tab, a outlined button. An outline button also indicates a secondary action secondary to the big, bold new customer button. So these methods of designing buttons and links allow users to basically go through your workflows as easy as possible without confusion on what actions that they should be taking. So those are our top three components for design. We went through the table component, icons, and buttons and links. So thank you everyone for listening to our webinar on design. And I know we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A tab, so I will stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. That was really, really informative. We do have a lot of questions. This event is supposed to go until 10 a.m. Pacific time, so we have about 8 minutes, but I don't know if we can stay on a bit longer to answer questions. I guess if anyone has to hop off, you can't, but I'll just quickly go through them. So let's order by upvotes here. So James Cook is asking, is there a way, or is there going to be a way to increase the amount of snap points horizontally and vertically?
Well, I mean, I hate to start off with a negative, but I don't, not in terms of a nice roadmap. There is a public roadmap, incidentally, if you're a customer, and any one of us would be happy to talk through. In broad terms, theming and styling will be one of the roadmap themes next year, but in terms of the specifics of what's going to be delivered, I'm afraid we don't have any news for you today.
Okay.
I will add on to that if this is actually a feature and not a bug in Retool, because the point of Retool is that it's quick to design and it's quick to build apps. And so we have a 12-column, 12-pixel grid horizontally. The point of that is so you're not spending 20 minutes trying to figure out how to center a div, and instead you only have 12 options to center all of your components, align all of your components. And so hopefully all of these guardrails that Retool actually adds makes the process of design easier.
Great, thanks. All right, so next one is Callie. I think, well, someone asked a similar question in the chat. This is a complex app. Where do you start with something like this? Is there an easy way to create these separately and then merge them together?
Should we take it in turns? I think we've probably both got quite a few answers to this, but why don't you go first on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the ideation process, where do you start? I'm going to share my screen real quick and show you some slides that John and I have worked together on for quite some time now. John is my partner in crime in all things design. And here's a 3-part framework that John and I have come up with to start guiding your questions around design. The first one is obviously, when you're starting with a larger project, it's often easy to overlook some problems, or we're all familiar with scope creep in 6 months after launch. Someone's like, oh, wait, I forgot about this use case or that use case. We try to avoid that, and our recommendation is to sit down at first, start with all of your business stakeholders, all of your users, all of the engineers and designers that are integrated with this app, and talk about all the problems that you want to solve. That's the first step, talking about all the problems, the system required, data required, narrowing that down, creating a project brief. It could be a few paragraphs, it could be multiple pages, depending on your business and scope of the project. Aligning on what you want to connect data to. And then the last part of all of this is doing that user feedback, testing, asking the questions that I brought up at the beginning about usability, credibility, deployment. So that's kind of where we would start off with scoping a project like this. In terms of actually building it, I like your suggestion of creating things separately and then merging them together. The way that, and I think folks, we also want to make sure that we're aligning with your internal dev workflow. And so if you're familiar with our source control feature, if you're an enterprise or on-premise customer, that is another way in which we can kind of integrate into your existing Git workflows and dev workflows. But in terms of creating separately and then merging together, yeah, definitely start breaking up apps into separate milestones or components. So if you saw in John and I's example app, you have the sidebar. Let's start off with that. And then you have like multiple tabs, and you take tab one at a time and test the tabs individually. I wouldn't necessarily recommend building it on entirely separate apps and then copying and pasting them in, but I would think about it in separate sections.
Yeah.
Great.
And I'll just add the one thing on top, like probably the most popular use, say, of the modules capability, which is just outright building something and then reusing it across multiple apps, is things like navigation, the navigation bars, things that are very consistent and you can move them across multiple apps, very popular for that. And sometimes just copying and pasting from one place to another and reusing the underlying resources. Quite often there's API calls and SQL queries underneath the hood. Those can also be reused. So there's a few capabilities on the developer side as well that can be really useful for that, starting separately and bringing it together.
Cool, thanks. Dimitri is asking, do you involve designers in the design process?
Yeah, well, in a lot of ways, Julie's given a pretty strong answer to that already, I would say. The answer is yes. I mean, there's a bit of a mix in that it's not necessary. I mean, it's kind of on a design webinar to maybe say you don't need a designer, but in the context of what Retool's used for, I like the point about we've got a relatively straightforward 12-column method that lets you move really quickly and build things quickly. So you can get started without a designer, but I would say start with certainly design thinking in mind. Do try to think like a designer. And if you are in an environment where you have designers available, like there's an aspect of human-centered thinking is one of the phrases or one of the skills you'll hear of. Interaction design is a skill set in its own right, and it can be a really valuable skill to bring in. The kind of confidence, and it relates back to that three-step framework that Julie went through, is I would always, if I had access to a designer, include one at the start. And if I didn't, I'd strongly recommend involving one at the end of let's say, your first iteration to get feedback and help you develop the next process. Not just for the designing the app, but there's a certain skill set around working with users to find out whether you have built something usability and where the issues lie. So absolutely yes. I mean, we like to think we've built something where it's not necessary, but highly advisable. If you've got that skill set available, that kind of eye for design, really, really valuable to bring into your project.
Cool, thanks. Let's squeeze in one more question. I know there's a lot here, and what I'll do is the ones that we can't get to, I will look up the answer and we'll include it in the email to everybody. So everyone who's registered today, it'll go out in an email and probably even like a post in our forum to be able to access. So I just had this open and it went away, the question that I was going to ask. What so it seems this is a yes no question, and then we can kind of close it out for Q&A. Are you able to call out override a specific predefined theme created within a component versus using the default theme?
Yeah, so whenever you're going into your app in edit mode and you have, let's say, that predefined theme that John showed, so you have all your beautiful primary, secondary colors, you can always override that default theme. And you can do that in the for Eventide. I know we're right on the app, so I'm not going to share my screen, but you can always do that within a component. So let's say you're changing the color of a button. It'll first show you all of the possible options, but then you can go in with even some custom JavaScript. So if you want a dynamic button based off of data in other parts of your app, you can set a hex code and you can override that default theme. The reason why we provide the predefined theme is so that you have a default guardrail for design. And so by default, all of your apps look consistent. But you definitely can do that in the settings of any component.
Cool. Thanks, Julie. All right, so that concludes the Q&A and the event overall. So that's a wrap. Thank you to everybody who attended today. I hope this meetup was both informative and insightful for everyone. As a next step, please be on the lookout for an email from either myself or Jake Levenger, in which we will send to anyone who registered for this event, a link to the YouTube where this recording will be housed, and then some downloadable examples of what we covered today, along with some advanced app examples. So if you have any follow-up questions, please share them on community.retool.com or with me directly, Alina at retool.com. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next month.